Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Daniel DePietris. I'm a fellow at Defense Priorities, a think tank that prioritizes realism and restraint in the foreign policy discourse. It's my pleasure and honor to introduce you all to this very important event titled Syria After Assad, Prospects for U.S. Withdrawal. As I'm sure everybody knows, Syria has been really undergoing a significant political transition over the last 2 months. We are about a little over 2 months since an armed opposition movement led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham overthrew Bashar al-Assad's regime. Assad is sitting in essentially self-imposed exile in Moscow as we speak. HTS and its leader, Ahmed al-Shara, has wasted no time trying to consolidate power. He's suspended the constitution, suspended the legislature, established a transitional government, and is preparing for a national dialogue to pave the way for a new political transition. And of course, all of this is occurring as U.S. troops, approximately 2,000 of them, remain inside eastern Syria, ostensibly on an anti-ISIS mission. So what is the state of Syria's political transition? How is the United States handling it? And given everything that we've known and everything that has occurred over the last 2 months, should the United States change its policy in any way? Should U.S. troop withdrawals be on the table as an option? It's my pleasure to introduce three very well-acclaimed speakers who can testify to all of these issues. The first one, we have Dr. Rosemary Kalanick. She's the director of the Middle East program at Defense Priorities and publishes widely on energy security, great power politics, and U.S. grand strategy in the Middle East. She's the author of a recent op-ed, Trump's Syria sequel should end better than last time. And she also, I should say, wrote a very, very good policy paper in late December titled Wait and See, a Post-Assad Syria. Next up, we have Dana Stroll. She's the director of research at Shelley at Michael Kassan Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. She was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East from 2021 to 2023. And she also served as a senior professional staff member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for 5 years. She's everywhere. She's a very, very good analyst, and we're very happy to have her with us today. Finally, we have Dr. Stephen Simon. He's a senior fellow at the Quincy Institute and a visiting professor at Dartmouth College, where he teaches the Middle East policy. And of course, he's a very frequent guest for us, and I would be honored to say a great friend. He's a former national security senior director for the Middle East, North Africa, and he's also the author of a recent policy paper called A New Era, Responding to a Post-Assad Syria. So with those very impressive credentials out of the way, let's get started. Thank you all three for being here. I wanted to open the discussion with a very, very simple question, but I think it's good to kick us off because it kind of generates some good debate on U.S. policy options and what the United States may do going forward. What are the main U.S. interests in Syria, and have they changed since the fall of Bashar al-Assad's regime? Let's see. Rose, would you like to go first? And then we'll have Dana, and then Stephen can close us out on the opening remarks.
Sounds great. Awesome. So I'm excited to be here today talking about this, and thanks everybody for tuning in. And thanks to my co-panelists for joining, and Dan for moderating ably, as I'm sure he will and already is. In terms of what are the main U.S. interests in Syria and whether they've changed, I would say that I'll answer the second part of that first, which is to say that they have not changed significantly since Assad's fall. And both before Assad's fall and after, U.S. interests in Syria are actually very minor. And I think, I'm afraid, quite misunderstood in Washington and in the public at large, which is to say that Syria is a failed state. It has been since the civil war. It's tragic what's happened in Syria. Their economy has shrunk by 80% since the pre-war levels. Huge numbers of Syrians are in poverty. This is all awful from a humanitarian perspective. From a national security perspective, there's very little that happens in Syria that is going to affect the United States. And I can already hear the objections to that statement. The reasons that people think that we need to be in Syria tend to do with its status as a failed state and worries that an actor like ISIS Perhaps ISIS itself or some other terrorist group could use Syria as a launch pad for launching terrorist attacks against the United States and its allies around the world. It's the safe havens argument. It's the same argument that we had about Afghanistan that drove the United States to invade and stay there for 20 years. And to me, the real interest and the real concern is that we'll misunderstand the idea that there's really no such thing as a safe haven anymore from American power. That there are actors on the ground in Syria and in neighboring countries like Turkey, all of whom have an interest in containing ISIS. Well, first of all, ISIS has been defeated. They no longer exist as a territorial caliphate. The attacks that they have mounted are all local and relatively rudimentary. The ISIS in Syria, the original ISIS, right, the ISIS OG, so to speak, the second part of it is, right, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria has ceased to exist. There are other ISISes around the world, like ISIS Khorasan, it's based in Afghanistan. They still exist, they still plot attacks, but they are not the same entity as the ISIS that was in Syria. The US has defeated that ISIS, and it's able to still intervene, discover, detect, disrupt plots by terrorist groups around the world, including ISIS Khorasan, from a distance, even though we no longer have a presence in Afghanistan. So I think if the United States leaves Syria, it would not significantly degrade our ability to detect and disrupt plots, any plots that might emanate from Syria. So the only real interest that we have is the 2,000 American soldiers that are stationed there, who are in harm's way, who are there as a result of policy inertia, and who are essentially easy targets for Iran and Iran-allied groups to attack. And by doing that, impose costs on the United States for being there. So they're magnets for bad attention. They're magnets for bad attention by local actors. So that's my view, and I look forward to hearing disagreements from others.
Thanks so much for having me, and a pleasure to be with all of you for this important conversation. So the aspect where I'm going to agree with Rose is that U.S. interests have not changed in Syria before Assad to where we are now. I see several interests. One definitely is countering terrorism and the threat coming from ISIS. Also, Iran and the way Iran has used Syria as a base from which to project power and instability across the Middle East. And finally, Russia and the manner in which it has also used Syria, and in particular, the naval base that it was provided by the Assad regime on the Eastern Mediterranean to not only threaten aspects of the Middle East, but also Europe. So let me take those in sequence. First of all, with respect to ISIS, you're right, Rose, the territorial caliphate that ISIS took across Iraq and Syria no longer exists. A lot of the considerations about the Defeat ISIS coalition talks about the enduring defeat of ISIS. Part of that is about residual pockets of ISIS, and actually, prior to the fall of the Assad regime, the areas and pockets of Syria where ISIS was most active was in Assad regime-controlled parts of Syria, not in the parts of Syria that the United States forces are present in. But there are several critical parts of the enduring defeat of ISIS mission that have not been achieved yet. First of all, there are 9,000 ISIS fighters in detention across ad hoc facilities in northeastern Syria, and they are not under the custody of U.S. forces. They are under the custody of the Syrian Democratic Forces. Those are a local partner that the United States partnered with more than a decade ago when there was no other viable, credible, combat, reliable military to take on ISIS in Syria. So the U.S. partnered with the Syrian Democratic Forces, or the SDF, have provided them limited forms of equipment, intelligence, operational intelligence, and funding. And these are people who have bled and taken on the Defeat ISIS mission on behalf not only of the United States, but the entire Middle East and, frankly, the international community. And right now, the SDF are under tremendous pressure to continue this mission. They are under pressure from the Syrian National Army, the SNA. They're under pressure from a NATO ally, Turkey, and they're under pressure on the ground in Syria as they figure out what their relationship will be with President Ahmed al-Shara and the new government in Damascus. But what I do think is really critical here to emphasize is that ISIS looks at those 9,000 fighters in detention facilities, and it sees the way to replenish its ranks. When ISIS gets those 9,000 fighters out of those detention facilities, and we know just from the past couple of years that they have attempted to, and at times successfully, launch prison breaks to liberate some of these fighters, that they are going to seek to reconstitute the caliphate. They are going to seek to cause mass terror across the Middle East, and they are going to use Syria as a base from which to inspire, plan, direct, and launch transnational attacks. And we've seen a lot of that happen actually very specifically and recently in the United States, such as New Orleans. So I would argue that the risk still exists and that actually the U.S. mission for what it is at this moment in time is sustainable. Although given the changes in Damascus, it is the time to start thinking through the conditions under which we would transition and end our military mission. But that shouldn't happen yet. And really, it's because the risk of ISIS reconstituting and the threat that poses to the international community is quite serious. There's also 40,000 ISIS-affiliated families and displaced persons camps in northeast Syria. So ISIS is looking at those 9,000 fighters in the detention facilities as the way to immediately replenish their ranks. And they're looking at the ISIS-affiliated families and specifically the children that are being born in these camps every single month as ISIS 2.0, the next generation. And this is really a stain on the international community that this population is not receiving the services and the repatriation activities necessary to reduce the population so that it's not a risk. In terms of the U.S. military role, it's not to do all of this on its own, and it is not a United States responsibility on our own either. But there is a role for us to work with the international community to both make sure that our local partner, the Syrian Democratic Forces, have a future within Syria, where they are not taken on and slaughtered, frankly, by Turkey or other armed opposition forces on the ground, and also that we leave these unique populations in a disposition in which ISIS cannot replenish its ranks. I want to talk a little bit about Iran and a little bit about Russia before I end the opening remarks. So last year, 2024, was a really critical year in how the Iran-sponsored threat network across the Middle East was confronted and degraded. Bashar al-Assad in Damascus is the one strategic state partner, or was, of the Iranian regime. And Iran used land routes across Syria to resupply Hezbollah in Lebanon, as well as plenty of other non-state actors all across the Middle East. With Assad out and this government in Damascus who's actually interested in making sure that Syria is not used for outside stakeholders to foment and project instability and conflict, there are opportunities here as well for the United States to address its counter-Iran objectives. Not necessarily with expanding a U.S. military mission, that's not what I'm talking about, but it will require other tools in the U.S. toolbox, like diplomacy, like coordination with allies and partners, and perhaps thinking through incremental sanctions relief and even some assistance. Finally, I would argue that the United States does have critical national security interests in Syria. Syria for so long, not only under Bashar al-Assad, but also under Hafiz al-Assad, his father, was an epicenter from which chaos, instability, terrorism projected across the Middle East. And I think it's worth for your listeners just revisiting some of the ways in which Syria was a threat to the international community. Under Bashar al-Assad, Syria developed a covert illicit nuclear weapons program. It developed a chemical weapons program, which to this date has not been completely dismantled. It was Bashar al-Assad who emptied out his prisons of Sunni extremists, opened his border from Syria into Iraq when U.S. forces were present in Iraq after 2003, leading to the maiming and deaths of thousands of U.S. soldiers when those prisoners formed the core of al-Qaeda in Iraq. This is a regime who, again, allowed that territory to be used by Iran to proliferate sophisticated weapons across the Middle East. This is a regime who actively cultivated, produced, and then shipped a narcotic captagon across the region. This is a regime who was unwilling and incapable of participating in any meaningful way in stopping the assault of ISIS across mass swaths of the Middle East. So this transition in Syria, I think, is a remarkable time and really a once-in-a-generation opportunity for the United States to think about seizing opportunities to set the Middle East on a more stable path. It doesn't mean that U.S. military carry that mission alone. It doesn't even necessarily mean an expanded U.S. military mission. But it is worth acknowledging the platform on which the existing U.S. military right now in Syria can support some of these efforts going forward, and the value that the rest of the international community places on the United States having skin on the game when we ask our partners to also contribute. Thanks.
Thank you, Dana. Stephen, go ahead, please. Oh, Stephen, you're on mute. You're muted. There we go.
I just ran through my whole presentation. Just kidding. I'm going to be brief. I mean, I think Dana and Rose have been quite eloquent in the points that they've made. I don't have much to add, really, on the issue of ISIS on the one hand, or the effect of Syrian stability on U.S. GDP on the other. I think those issues were covered quite nicely. I'd say, look, there's no core interest of the United States in Syria, but there are important derivative ones. So what are these? I think most generally is that the United States prizes stability, or generally does, with serious exceptions that, we're all aware of. But it prizes stability, and there are conditions in Syria right now that are at odds with continuing stability in the region to the extent that it exists at all right now. So the U.S. would want to, the U.S. would have an interest in mitigating those destabilizing conditions, particularly in Syria. As I said, Dana has, pointed to the ISIS issues. We could have a more nuanced discussion of the ISIS threat, particularly to the United States and American homeland security, later in the discussion, if you wish. But I think rather that the issues of instability that interest the United States or have a derivative impact on American interests are mostly internal to Syria right now and not necessarily having much to do with ISIS. It has to do with the new government's control over its territory. And that's an issue, because unless there's central control over Syrian territory, then past will be prologue, and we'll see yet another feeding frenzy of outsiders devouring Syria from within and destabilizing it and creating the conditions for further armed conflict, which could implicate the United States militarily. And that's something that we really wouldn't want to see. So, I would infer from, that premise that there are some things the United States would want to do to preserve its interests and stability. And one of those would be to foster Jolani's control over the country. Jolani is not everybody's cup of tea. I understand that. I think there are actually serious problems with Jolani's ideology, the kind of government he might run or he might not. We don't know that yet. But in the interests of stability, you need to have some kind of core authority that can exercise control throughout the country, at least eventually. So that means that the United States has to take actions that will enhance his authority, as difficult as that might be to do. The first thing would be sanctions relief, presumably. The second would be assistance to the Syrian population, especially, if there are returnees, which there might be. There could be as many as 6 million returnees from overseas, from across Syria's borders back into Syria. The U.S. might want to restore control of oil to the transitional government. In the interest of fostering territorial control and unifying the country under the leadership of a single government, might want to build contacts in the security arena with that new government. And of course, there have already been contacts between the United States government and the transitional government in Syria. And those presumably could be built upon. The United States has the organizations and the apparatuses, to accomplish that. Secondly, we'll want to deal with outsider claims to Syrian territory, especially by the U.S., Turkey, and Israel. And perhaps Russia will be an issue in this regard. It's really too early to tell. It does look, at least to me, that the Iran piece of this is OBE. It's not really a factor, but perhaps it could recur in the fullness of time, as unlikely as it seems right now. But given the risks of outside involvement, which is already underway, we're talking about the presence of 2,000 U.S. troops in country, but there are Turkish army units, and of course there are Israeli bivouacs and perhaps more permanent installations already east of Quneitra, east of the old demilitarized zone that separates the Golan from Syrian territory. So that creates the risks of escalation and violent contact between these forces. And that's not something we want to see because it's multi-layered. The U.S. could wind up in a tangle with the transitional government, could wind up in a tangle with Turkey. Israel could wind up in a tangle with Turkey, in which case we'd have two allies, one informal, one a treaty ally, going at each other. That would damage U.S. interests, certainly. Confrontation between Israel and the transitional government itself, if elements of that government want to challenge Israel's presence on Syrian territory. So all this adds up to two interlinked sets of interests, and the United States probably needs to deal with both of them. In the first case, it's primarily in the realm of sanctions and to some extent in security. And the second will require talks, either direct or indirect, involving Israel, Turkey, the transitional government, and the United States. That's it.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you very much. Rose, I wanted to go to you first because in your paper from, I believe it was late December when it was published, obviously a lot has changed inside Syria between late December and, late February. The premise of my question is in that paper, you kind of suggested that the United States should maybe hold off a little bit on providing reconstruction assistance to a post-Assad government, mainly because at that time, we didn't know if HTS is going to consolidate its authority. I was wondering if you had a different assessment over the last 2 months, or maybe a slightly more nuanced assessment, or do you kind of agree with yourself back in December?
Yeah, so great question. I kind of agree with myself back in December, which is to say we're still waiting to see what happens in terms of al-Shara consolidating authority. It still remains to be seen what kind of constitution is going to be drawn up, or if one really is going to be drawn up. It remains to be seen whether the various factions in Syria are actually going to give up their weapons and join the central government, or are they actually going to fight to avoid that outcome. That's all up in the air. But I do still think it's not just the argument that we don't know if they have staying power yet, although I think that's an important argument. It's also the case that whenever the United States really invests resources, we have a very difficult time walking away from a bad investment. And it could go down in a number of very bad ways. So let's say that we decide that we want to invest in Shara and he becomes this criminal, brutal dictator. And then the United States has just tarnished its reputation by aligning itself with somebody who has this nasty regime and is involved in crimes against their own people. That's not something the United States necessarily wants to do. But it's also the case that once the U.S. gets invested in something like nation building in Syria, and I think, I super respect everything that Dana said on this, and she said it extremely eloquently, but it just kind of terrifies me, the idea that the United States thinks it can go in and socially engineer Syria to go in a direction that we want it to go, in a direction that we think is stable and a better path and in our interests, when there's been no U.S. intervention in the Middle East in the last 25 years that has had that outcome, right? So we go into Iraq, it's a mess, right? The fact that we go and knock off Saddam Hussein and Iraq has a civil war and it becomes a failed state and births, takes a big role in birthing ISIS, is because we went in and destabilized the place with these ideas, thinking that we'd be able to socially engineer it into a democracy in the Middle East. And that turned out to be, completely misguided, right? So this idea that the U.S. can go in and actually steer events and socially engineer our way to a Syria that will be an anchor for a new, stable, happy Middle East is just belied by our examples in Iraq, in Libya, in Syria. There's nowhere that we've been that has come out better for it, really. I don't know. That's probably an overstatement, but it's certainly been grief for all parties involved. And once the U.S. invests in an ally, if we deem, the new Syrian government to be that, we start to feel like our credibility is on the line if something bad happens to them, or if they go a different way or whatnot. And so it just becomes very easy to get drawn further and further into something that is just at base not a core American interest. I'm happy to hear disagreement.
Dana, please, your name was brought up. I'd love to get your take on this as well.
I think those are really important points. So first of all, I think it's important to put in the appropriate context what the U.S. military mission is in Northeast Syria, because it's not a nation building project, and it's actually distinct, very distinct from Iraq. So I think actually the way in which the authorities and the mission of those U.S. forces in Syria have been both legislated by Congress and then sustained through policy for the past 3 administrations speaks to exactly what Rose is saying, which is humility about the limits of what the United States can actually socially engineer or create in societies. So the goal of the military mission in Northeast Syria is not a stable, happy Middle East. It's not a nation building project, and it's not about picking an ally. It was about picking at a very specific moment in time the only local partner who was capable and willing of taking the fight to ISIS. And because the SDF were willing to do it, there was a limited U.S. military mission in Northeast Syria, together with limited contributions from others. It's not only the United States. And until there's another viable replacement for some of the role that the United States military is playing, what I would argue is I don't think anyone thinks the U.S. military is going to be in Syria forever, certainly not for the next decade. And frankly, al-Shara himself in Damascus has said he wants the U.S. military out. He has an interest in not having ISIS reconstitute and undermine any of the progress, because ISIS actually would like him to lose, and they would like him to not be able to assert control over all the different armed groups in Syria. ISIS is going to flourish in an unstable, ungoverned, or undergoverned context. And so this sort of gets to what Steve was talking about earlier, which is, do we have an interest in helping this government in Damascus reassert control, because some stability is in the U.S. interest? So just to be clear, the U.S. military mission is constrained legislatively, constrained in terms of appropriations, focused only on providing operational intelligence and supporting the SDF in taking the fight to ISIS, and supporting the SDF in maintaining custody of those 9,000 ISIS fighters, which gets to the other point, which I also think is very important. I think we're at a point in the U.S. debate where we're not actually talking about the United States being the majority burden holder for reconstruction in Syria. And in fact, we have multiple pieces of legislation that have blocked not only the United States from participating or funding the reconstruction, but they're actually blocking others who might want to get in the game of reconstruction in Syria. But what the United States can do, if we want to give the al-Shara government an opportunity to stabilize the Syrian economy and give him and his government a chance at reasserting territorial control over Syria, is get out of the way. And that would be some amount of sanctions relief, which Stephen also talked about. And it doesn't mean lifting all the sanctions either. There's actually plenty of policy flexibility in the sanctions architecture right now. We have some of that already with something called General License 24, which was announced in January, which provides just 6 months to provide some sanctions relief so that some can get involved in Syria, and it's not the United States. So one thing we could do if we have these interests that Rose talked about whether or not we want al-Shara to be able to reassert territorial control, if we like to see his transitional government put the steps to a national dialogue, draft a new constitution, try to govern in a way that would not cause Syria to lapse back into deadly civil war, you can actually think through what measured and incremental sanctions relief looks like in order to incentivize those steps without the United States doing all of the reconstruction itself or like completely lifting all the sanctions. So there's nuance in what the road ahead looks like. And I imagine those are the discussions happening right now within the U.S. executive branch.
Stephen, speaking on the sanctions piece, there's a lot of discussion in Washington. I mean, it's sort of an old adage. It's easy to put sanctions onto a country, but it's extremely difficult politically and even technically to put them off. So in Syria specifically, do you think, to the extent that there's a discussion about sanctions relief for the new regime, should it be conditional on the new Syrian government meeting certain benchmarks, which is what I believe Dana was sort of alluding to, or should it be a little bit more proactive, or how would you structure sanctions relief to kind of incentivize good behavior? Stephen, you're muted again.
Sanctions relief would have to be structured in any way that the administration was able to sell it in Washington. That's going to impose constraints on the way sanctions relief is constructed. And, on the one hand, there'll be a lot of pressure to make it highly conditional and short-lived. In that case, the sanctions relief that obtains won't really be effective because firms that operate, for reconstruction and stabilization purposes, and the banks that finance these kinds of operations tend to overcomply with sanctions regimes when it's not absolutely clear that the sanctions are over, because nobody wants to get into a wrangle with the Department of Justice or Treasury, over these kinds of things. So I think that's nonetheless a constraint that sanctions relief will probably have to accommodate to for political reasons. But it wouldn't be the best outcome, of course. The best outcome would be something like the sanctions relief that was extended to Syria after that terrible earthquake a few years ago, where I think the license was almost for a year, or was a year's license. And it was an open door to all kinds of trade and reconstruction, especially, using heavy equipment and, big, excavating firms coming in and doing, important infrastructural work. So that would be better. And there is a precedent. So perhaps, that precedent could shape, thinking in Washington as policymakers and legislators decide, well, how far should we go with this? Right now, looking to Damascus, al-Shara, he's got problems. He has a disparate coalition, and many components of his coalition are far to the right of where he is. And they're prone to retributive violence, which is already going on. They're prone to boosting social arrangements within Syria that are very alienating, I think, to most Americans. particularly with regard to minorities and women. I don't think necessarily that this is where Shara is about. I mean, if you listen to his interviews, not with members of the American or British press, but interviews locally or with the Arabic media, it's really interesting because he becomes very nearly impenetrable. Very difficult to interpret, his remarks, and he's quite clearly walking a very thin line. So he's got, in a sense, alliance management issues that he needs to deal with that are very pressing. So for Americans who are looking at progress towards democracy, or whatever you want to call it, in Syria during this period, the evidence is going to be very ambiguous, and there will be things that that are ugly, and that's going to be an issue. But if we define our policies in terms of our interests, then we're going to say, well, this is just something we're going to have to live with while this guy tries to, herd those cats and exert control over the country so that it doesn't, fall apart.
Yeah, that's great, Dana. I think there's an assumption, now that Assad is gone, there seems to be this general assumption that Syria is certainly not at peace, but it's not at war anymore either. That's not necessarily true, of course. So you have the Syrian National Army fighting the Syrian Democratic Forces along, certain aspects of the Turkey-Syria border. I was wondering, to the state of Syria's overall security situation, how do you? I know it's difficult to prognosticate, but how do you see that unfolding, particularly on the Kurdish question, where you have negotiations between al-Shara and the SDF that don't appear to be making much headway? Where do you see that going over the next several months?
These are critical questions. So if we're looking at the history and the statistics here, it doesn't bode well for Syria. Yes, Assad is out, but the reality is the underlying drivers of conflict still exist in Syria. And generally in a so I share your assessment that the hot war is over, but this is still a very unstable place. Al-Shara and his government have not yet reasserted control over all parts of Syria. There are still plenty of armed opposition groups, and they have not all disarmed, turned in their weapons, agreed that they're going to be part of this new national project in Syria. And of course, the SDF is a huge question mark here, which will have major implications from Syria. Not only, is the security question the most important in a post-conflict, but the Syrian economy is crashing as we speak right now. Prices are skyrocketing. Most Syrians do not have more than 1 hour of electricity a day. They're unable to afford basic commodities. This is a mix. And so the mix is terrible for the future of Syria. And Syrians are going to be looking to al-Shara, and the honeymoon period is very short as to whether or not he can deliver. And if they can't look to him, then they're going to look to either some outside actor, or they're going to look to some alternative armed group to try to get what they need. And just in response to something Stephen said earlier about the Iran question is OBE, I think one of my concerns is that the underlying networks through which Iran projected influence across Syria haven't gone away just because the Tehran-Assad alliance is broken. So whatever those illicit trafficking routes were for sophisticated weapons, for fighters, for drugs, they still exist. Those networks exist, and the groups on the ground know where they are. So if there's not something national for everyone to look toward, then I think the likelihood is all of those networks continue in a way that's deeply destabilizing for Syria, for the Syrian people, and for the Middle East. On the question of the SDF, we're at an interesting moment, and I think especially General Mazloum, the leader of the SDF, he's actually saying the right things right now. He took down a Syrian Kurdish flag, put up the Syrian national flag of Shara. He has talked about seeing the future of his forces within a Syrian national army context. He's offered to meet with al-Shara, and al-Shara has acknowledged that the Kurds of Syria have experienced atrocities under the Assad regime, just like other Syrians. So there is the potential for everyone to look toward a better future here. And the U.S., for what it's worth, has been playing a facilitating role since December, which is to encourage the SDF to look toward Damascus. So I think there is a potential outcome here where the U.S. has a role in facilitating knitting this fabric together. But generally speaking, I remain really concerned because we've seen the post-conflict story too many times, and very rarely can the new government do all these things, especially without outside support. Al-Shara did reasonably well in Idlib, in northwest Syria. Not at all the ethnically, religiously diverse situation you find in the rest of Syria. And if what he's thinking is that taking the governance experience of Idlib and scaling it up to the rest of Syria without adaptability and flexibility is going to work, I think he is going to learn some very hard lessons.
Rose, speaking of the Kurds, we all know, and Dana alluded to it earlier, we have about, I don't know the exact figure, but it's really tens of thousands of ISIS fighters and their families who remain in these, constellation a network of camps in the northeast of Syria, and you hear a lot, especially in the Pentagon, where if the United States leaves, either precipitously or even through a gradual withdrawal, there's a chance that those forces could be either freed in some way or break out of prison, and then it could regenerate the ISIS network more broadly. I guess my question is, what is the best way to address that issue? And does the United States have to deal with the issue before they even consider withdrawing?
Yeah, so it is an important issue, yet the United States does not need to take ownership of this issue, right? Nobody has a stronger interest in maintaining Nobody has a stronger interest in keeping ISIS prisoners from reconstituting than the people who actually live in the areas where these people are being held, right? And so it's kind of like, the way I interpret it is like the old Washington Monument thing, or, anytime that somebody talks about budget cuts to the Pentagon, right? The very first thing that the Pentagon says is, well, if you cut the budget of the Pentagon, then we're going to have to cut salary to our troops, which of course is the most politically unpopular thing ever and kills it immediately, right? Like, well, we need to, do some cuts to the National Park Service. Okay, well, I guess we'll just have to shut the Washington Monument, right? Like, these are not serious threats. It's not the case that the SDF is going to just turn these people loose and allow them to wreak havoc on areas held by the SDF if the United States stops supporting them. But they sort of make it out to be the case that that's what would happen. And it's just not, right? That would be so against their own interests to do that. And this idea that, the SDF, the Kurds in Syria, obviously have conflict with Turkey. The SNA and the SDF are battling out in various places, that somehow in this confusion and fog of war between these sides, the ISIS fighters would escape. I mean, both of those actors, both the SNA and the SDF, would immediately go after ISIS, right? There's not a single group in the Middle East that ISIS did not totally alienate and piss off during its 5-year run as a caliphate, right? And so, what I think the thing that's really amazing to me with the whole fall of Syria is how little the United States had to do with it, and how much regional actors are actually able to make these events happen and get involved, right? Iran is in its weakest position in years, not because of anything the United States did, but because of HTS and Turkey and Israel. And so, I think that there's a viable balance of power in the Middle East that can operate in the absence of American forces. And actually, our involvement makes it harder for them to all figure out the settlement, the political settlement on the ground that can endure after the United States is gone. Because as long as we're there propping up the Kurds, right, that gives them a sort of false political bargaining leverage that depends on us continuing to prop up the Kurds ad infinitum, right? Which is not something the United States has ever promised to do, should ever promise to do, and is also just not credible that the United States would do that, right? So I worry that the U.S. is making it easier for the SDF to, thumb its nose at the central Syrian government, to act in ways that might, cause problems with the Turks, et cetera, et cetera. So the whole ISIS prison big scenario, I think, is very far-fetched, and local actors can handle that problem. And I'm not convinced that we make it that much better.
Stephen, what about that point Rose just made that, maybe it's possible that a U.S. presence in northeast Syria could serve as a disincentive for the Kurds to maybe make a deal with the new authorities in Damascus. Do you share a similar concern, or do you have a different take on it?
No, I share Rose's view on this. I mean, the presence of U.S. forces essentially serving as a bodyguard for the Kurds is problematic in terms of incentivizing the Kurds to, seek out autonomy arrangements within Syria that they've long wanted, but which don't bode well for the integrity of the state, principally because of, predatory Turkish attitudes towards the Kurds and hostility towards their desires for autonomy. And I understand where the Turks are coming from, and there is an unavoidable interpenetration of the PKK and other segments of the Kurdish community in Syria. I think there's little doubt about that. So the Turks are quite nervous here, and they're feeling as though they can't let the Kurds get away with this, as it were. So if the United States were to say, listen, we're actually going to pull chocks here, we're going to leave, then that might incentivize the Kurds to approach the issue of unification and integration with the broader Syrian project, as Dana put it, and that would be salutary. That would be good for everyone, probably. Although it's hard to know whether the parties are going to stick to their pledges in this context. So trust levels are very low, which is why the agreement has been so elusive thus far. I mean, I would prefer to think of the U.S. troop presence in the context of the Kurdish-Turkish Damascus problem as a bargaining chip more than anything else right now. So if it's in as Dana put it, if it's in Ashar's interest to get foreign forces out of Syria, and if he wants the Americans out, well, then there are certain things he has to undertake in order to facilitate an American departure. And one of those would be to make enduring and reliable pledges to the Kurds that meet Kurdish needs while facilitating their integration into this project. So I'd be disinclined, I think, to preemptively remove U.S. forces. I think they're there, and there's something that we should get in return for their withdrawal. And this Kurdish issue is exactly in that domain.
Dan, I'd love to get your take as well as a former senior Pentagon official on this.
So I agree with Stephen here. And the frame is this. As I said earlier, I don't think anyone is under any illusion that the United States military is going to stay in Syria in perpetuity. And so the question is, under what conditions can we transition that military mission to another responsible actor? And I think it's exactly this. The there have, of course, been a lot of confusions and overreadings about the policy, but the legislation that authorizes U.S. military support to the SDF and what the policymakers have been telling SDF the entire time is that our support was not for an autonomous state, a statelet. It was always in the context of a very specific and tailored counterterrorism mission. Now, I do think that there was always a risk, and certainly it happened that there was an overreading and optimism about what the U.S. military might be willing to do. But the reality is the policy was never that. And frankly, the U.S. military didn't serve as a bodyguard for the SDF. In fact, they've been getting killed by Turkish airstrikes for years. And the United States has intentionally not made this a central pillar of confrontation with Turkey. If anything, the confrontations were about other things, NATO accession, the S-400, Turkey and the F-35 program. It wasn't the targeting of the U.S. local partner who was taking the fight to ISIS was not the preeminent issue that the U.S. chose to make as an area of tension in the Turkey relationship, although certainly it was the area of core tension for Turkey when it looked at Washington and the United States. And because I think there's questioning of the SDF, I think they always understood the U.S. wasn't going to be there forever. And they looked at the experience of the U.S. military in Iraq, and they looked at the experience of the U.S. military in Afghanistan and said the United States isn't reliable. And we do have to have an insurance policy, which is why the SDF were always talking even to the Assad regime in Damascus long before the events of December, and why I think they actually recognize now, and you can hear it in the statements of Mazloum, you can hear it in the statements of the political leadership of the Syrian Kurds in northeast Syria, and we know that they're already talking to each other to exactly do what Stephen says, which is think through the terms upon which this area and the SDF can actually be integrated into a national Syrian force. I do think it's important just to talk about this idea that somebody else would just take over the detention facility mission. I don't think it's a question only of will, that of course the communities there will just take it over and the US doesn't have to be there. I think it's a question of capability and capacity and actually resources. And so what the US military is doing is not itself maintaining custody of these detention facilities. The US military is not there. We are talking about 9,000 fighters across more than a dozen facilities that are already unsafe and already unstable and not very well secured. And the SDF is already struggling to maintain positive control of these facilities because they are being attacked by the SNA, because they are being attacked by Turkey, and because they are also working on counterterrorism operations. So they are already under strain. And we've seen what happened when they were under strain, which is that ISIF launches prison breaks. And when those prison breaks happened, the community did not rise up to take positive control of ISIS and do something with them. Those guys actually were able to scatter. And it was only through the US military supporting the SDF that in 2022, we regained positive control of those fighters and put them back in a secure detention facility. So the issue is not an either or, it's the United States military or nothing. The question is, what are the resources, timing, and condition under which that mission can be transferred to somebody else? This is a good example where al-Shara has said the right things about wanting to take over this mission. But remember, this is a guy whose government at the same time is trying just to de-arm and demobilize everybody else, reassert security control over all of Syria. And so this is a question of sequencing, timing, and resources. And there, I think the United States, given our leadership in this Defeat ISIS coalition for more than 10 years, has an interest in not seeing it all collapse, which means we can be strategically patient for a period of time while we determine with others the conditions under which we can transfer this military mission.
We're about time. We're about at the top of the hour. So I'm going to ask one more question. I'd like all three of you to answer. To the extent that the Trump administration has a Syria policy, it obviously, look on the outside looking in, it's sort of difficult to know whether they have a Syria policy. I suspect they're probably still gathering information and trying to make a judgment about what is and is not in U.S. interests in that country. So I guess the closing question I have is, what would your recommendation to the administration be for Syria? What should the United States be prioritizing in this very, I guess, poor and post-conflict countries? Let's be honest, 14 years of civil war has wrecked the Syrian economy, and Syrian society as a whole has been shattered. So I'm curious as to what the priority should be for the United States going forward. Let's go the opposite way. Let's Stephen, Dana, and then Rose. You can close it out for us.
The UNDP's latest study says that even if Syria's economy was to surge, let's say to between 2.5 and 3% growth a year, it would take 10 years to get back to 2010 GDP levels. Okay, this is not a good scenario. So Syria, to avoid disintegration, has to get serious investment, a mix of public and private investment. And that's not going to happen as long as sanctions are in play. So if it's in the US interest to have, a cohesive, integrated Syria to whom the United States can talk and which can deliver on its own policies, the U.S. broader interest in stability in having stability in the region will be seriously jeopardized, and that's not a good thing.
So the administration faces, I think, a very understandable challenge here, which is, I think everyone would prefer to see a stable Syria that does not lapse into such deadly conflict that it becomes arena for either outside stakeholders to further foment instability, chaos, or becomes a base from which transnational terrorism plots are organized. But at the same time, the government in Damascus is an offshoot of al-Qaeda. And I think the administration should rightfully be deeply skeptical and not rush into Damascus. These are very serious decisions. And it's unclear whether al-Shara is going to govern in a manner that is genuinely delivering for all of Syrian in a way that doesn't further inflame violent extremism. But the administration faces, I think, it has 3 tools in its toolbox, and it's going to need to decide how to utilize them. The first one is engagement. Is it going to talk to Damascus? We have princes, emirs, presidents, and foreign ministers rushing to Damascus, and the leadership of Damascus, the new leadership, traveling all over the world. And the highest level meeting they've had with the US government is an assistant secretary last December. So there's a question for the administration. Does it want to engage and even test the premise that this government is responsive to some of our needs, like going after al-Qaeda, like making sure the chemical weapons are safely disposed of, like making sure that Syria is not used as a base for Iran going forward? Number 2 is this question of sanctions relief, sanctions waivers, lifting of the sanctions, question it, and tremendous leverage there. And third is whether the US military mission. Are we going to stay for some period of time before we think through the conditions under which we could safely end and transition this mission? So my recommendation to the administration would be to be highly skeptical, but test the premise. We should be talking to this government and giving them very specific requests and assessing whether or not they can act upon them. Continuing to act on the operational intelligence we're giving them to go after ISIS. They're actually doing important things on the Lebanon border where Hezbollah is trying to reconstitute. They are working to reassert control over parts of Syria, and they are trying very hard to stabilize the economy. We can decide whether we're going to test the premise that they can deliver for the Syrian people.
So I get to I don't know, back cleanup, as it were. So I think I'm very heartened that there's a lot of agreement in this conversation that the United States does not have an interest in keeping forces in Syria in perpetuity. And I'm certainly sympathetic to the idea that having forces there gives us some kind of bargaining chip that we might want to cash in some way and not just sort of throw away by pulling out for, no benefit or nothing in exchange. But the United States never said it was going to stay in Afghanistan for 20 years and never thought it was going to stay in Afghanistan for 20 years. And I don't think that anybody thought when American forces went to Syria in 2015 that they would still be there 10 years later. And I think as long as we keep wanting to cash in our chips for something in return, that's the kind of thing that leads to us having this stasis, having this inertia where, well, we want to make sure we get something in return that we like. And then what if that thing goes sideways? Well, then what will we do? And I just think it's the wrong way to be thinking about this conflict. It's the kind of thinking that keeps us there, unnecessarily for long periods of time and exposes American service members to deadly risks. And it's not just by bringing them home, we are ensuring their safety. It's also the case that by having forces there, if those forces are attacked, that gets us drawn in more and more to a conflict that's at its heart not our conflict and not something that's so deeply in the U.S. interest that anyone wants to stay for a period of time more than, I don't know, some small period of time, 10 years, right? I heard I think it was Dana said 10 years. So I think it's much better. I don't think we need to keep sanctions on Syria necessarily. I'm very, amenable to the argument that we can give them a chance. They're not Assad, and the sanctions were on Assad, and Assad is gone. That doesn't mean we need to run in and start giving them aid and start trying to tell them how to run their affairs and run their own country, because that doesn't tend to work out very well, and it tends to blow back against the United States eventually in the end.
Rose Kalanick, Dana Stroll, Stephen Simon, thank you so much for joining us. It was a great conversation. Thank you for tuning in, everybody. And please be sure to, monitor this feed. We'll have plenty of events and policy papers down the line. Thank you so much for joining us. Bye.